Hello and welcome to the Choreolosophy Podcast. I'm Chris Muntz, the host, and this is episode 27, Reboot, Restart, and Revitalize. This is the Happy New Year to all of you. I'm recording this on January 2nd, 2020. So we got all, for you numerologists out there, all the twos involved. It's also really exciting. This is not the topic of the episode, but I just thought I would throw this out there, and maybe no one else cares but me. But we finally have a legit name for a decade again. When I was a kid, we had decades like the 80s and the 90s. And then we had the aughts, the teens. If you notice, we just kind of stopped referring to the name of the decade. Now we can say it's the 20s. We could do this better because it's the 20s now. See, we can say things like that, which we could say when I was a kid. So for all you millennials out there who don't remember having legit decade names, welcome back. Welcome to the 20s. So I'm excited about this episode today. It's going to be just me, and I'm going to be talking to you about some things that I think are really important as we head back to school. The purpose of this episode is to help you learn from my mistakes in the past, but also learn from things that I feel like could help you reboot your school year, your choir rehearsal season, restart things if things are not going well for you. For many people, even when things are going well, they need to revitalize when they come back from a vacation. They need to inject energy back into the room. And I think my personal belief, this is something I was taught and I still have clung to it, is that if a rehearsal process or an ensemble itself is not going the way you want it to, it's your fault. Sorry if that's blunt, but as the conductor in the room, we are the ones that set the tone. So this episode is going to ultimately dive into some topics, 7 in fact, important concepts to master to keep your choir moving forward for an entire academic year. Sometimes we fall into ruts, sometimes the singers do. Ultimately, like I said before, both scenarios are bad, and they're your fault. As the director, I have had wildly successful school years. Okay, so some school years where I look back and think, wow, we killed it from the first day of school all the way to the end of the year. The kids learned, they got better, we had fun, we laughed, we cried. We did all of the things that make choir an experience. And then some school years that have fallen flat. In fact, just to give you the extreme example, there was one school year where my top choir at the high school was so bad. And I don't mean they sung badly. It might be that might be the case in some instances, but it was just a negative environment. It was me browbeating them the whole time to work hard, them resenting me for browbeating them. Very little was getting done, and I had to send home letters to each student in the choir at Christmas break of here's what you need to do next semester if you want to stay in this choir. That was bad. It was really negative. And part of that was, in fact, I think looking back on it, most of that was my fault. I look back on a school year like that where the kids didn't want to be there. Well, who's in charge of what goes on in the room? I am. It was my fault. It'd be easy as a teacher to look at a situation like that and we'll say, well, what were the kids doing wrong? And they were being jerks to each other and to me when they'd walk in the room. But for those of you out there who read, I don't know if this is still taught in music ed programs or not, but Harry Wong's First Days of School, that textbook that a lot of us got when we were learning how to teach, things have to be established on the first day of school. And in that school year that went so badly for me, I didn't do a good job of establishing the expectations at the beginning of the school year. I assumed too much about what kids would just do without me telling them. And so then by the time it got negative in the mid-year, it was very hard to wrangle that back. In fact, we never quite did. So taking that concept of there are certain things you've got to establish at the very beginning of the school year. That being said, if things are not going well mid-year, like it is now, there are still things you can do to reboot, restart, revitalize. And so when I've had some of those years in the past that didn't go well, these are some of the tricks, some of the concepts, some of the basic fundamentals that I try to go back to make sure that I can still salvage the school year. And even if the school year is going well and the rehearsals are going well, and I'm trying to get out of just school year only type of lingo, because of course many of you are church choir directors. The same concept goes there. Are there events in the church calendar that you can get behind you and then refresh, start over, set a new tone? Of course there are, and that's true in the community-based groups. I work with an adult group also that has, a rehearsal season that lasts essentially an academic year, and we might do a couple gigs and then not see each other for a while, and then do a couple more gigs. And so what you get to do again is you get to reset, you get to rebuild some concepts and some expectations every chance you get to leave, breathe again, and then come back with the choir. So that's what this episode is. I'm going to draw on some of that experience that I've had, the good and the bad, to come up with a list of winning strategies that are synthesized from my best years on the podium. So of all the best times, what were the things that I was doing to achieve that? If it helps you, I hope it does, that's great. And maybe you can pick out of the 7 I'm going to list, maybe 2 or 3 of them fit your agenda, and I hope that helps. And if nothing else, it might be something that's good food for thought for you, and feel free to kick the conversation back to me. Choralosophy@gmail.com is one way. Just shoot me if you want it to be a private conversation of, hey, I've tried this before, it didn't work for me, or I don't know if I would approach it that way, or just you want to say thanks for the ideas, and that is an option for you out there. If you want to engage more people than just me in the conversation, as always, you can go to Choralosopher's Facebook group, which is a group designed specifically for listeners of this show to get a chance to just communicate and be in community with the other folks that have kind of plugged into these topics that we talk about on the show. So I encourage you to do both of those things so that you can be plugged into the conversation. Before we dive into the list of 7 things, I want to shout out some sponsors, as we always do here on the podcast, and this is a very important and exciting part of the podcast as I continue to figure out ways to make this podcast pay for itself. One of the ways we do that is we affiliate with companies that I believe in. So as the host of the show, I get to decide which companies are the type and the kind that have helped me in my teaching and directing life, that I think if you were to turn around and use some of their products by these awesome people and experts in their fields, could also help you in your teaching life, your conducting life, your choral life. One of those is the newest sponsor to the show. That's Voce Vista Video. And that is a software. It's an actual downloaded software to your computer that you would load onto your school classroom device. And hopefully if you have a projector in your room, you can put it up on the screen so your students can see it, and or anyone in your life who needs to learn about how singing works. And that could be in a private lesson or at a choir rehearsal. And what it will do is it will show a picture of all the sound that's happening in the room, whether they're singing or not. Any sound that it hears, it will show you not only the pitches it's hearing, but the overtone series, the loudness, the softness, the patterns that are there. If you look back, I've got a couple episodes that explain that more in depth, but I strongly encourage that as a tool for you to have in your classroom. It is something that has absolutely and fundamentally changed my students' understanding of how to make resonant, in-tune sound. So that's a really, really important one. What you do there is you head to vocevista.com/choralosophy, and you can download a free trial for 30 days and just play with it. It does all the things that the software does for 30 days. And then if you decide you want to buy it, you just enter the promo code Choralosophy at checkout. You'll get your customary 10% off. So check that out. Also, sightreadingfactory.com. One of the things I'm going to talk about later in this episode is how to keep sight reading fresh throughout the year. And my main go-to tool is sightreadingfactory.com because of the ability to customize it, the challenge modes, all the individual assignments you can give kids. There's just so many different ways to keep that fresh over the year. So you can do sightreadingfactory.com at a discount also. As a listener of this show, enter that promo code Choralosophy. And last but not least, we have our sheet music publishers that are so instrumental to our success here at the show and to my success as a programming conductor. In fact, I was just doing some programming today. I'm a little bit behind on some things, Spent a lot of vacation time with my kids over this break, and didn't get to much work stuff, which I'm not sorry about, and needed some music now that we're looking at school coming back into session next week, and I need to get some stuff in my hands now. So what I'm doing is I'm heading over to ryanmain.com, I'm heading over to graphitepublishing.com, and I'm checking out those resources, and they affiliate with the show, which is awesome. So if you're going to do what I do, to try to pick out some of your music by some great, awesome living composers that you can reach out and email and ask questions to, then you can use Choralosophy at checkout there as well and get 10% off all 4 of those websites when you're heading back to school. So I encourage you to check out all those products, and those people are awesome supports if you have any questions. Okay, so you've come back to school, you've come back to your church choir, you've come back to your university choir, your adult or children's community choir, what have you. Bottom line, you've taken some time away and you've come back. And it's mid-season, right? So most of us in the choir world operate based on some kind of an academic year calendar, which I find to be interesting. But it makes sense because so many of our jobs are wrapped up in a school, and then we might have also a church or also a community choir or something that we do. We have to double dip, a lot of us. It is the very fortunate few, as Bernie Sanders would say, the 1% of the 1% that in the choir world that can do a job and have that be it, right? So when we talk about a season in the choir world, oftentimes they are wrapped around that academic year. So let's say August-ish to May, June-ish, right? And we kind of think of each of those years, of those academic years, as a unit, whether it's a community choir or an academic choir, or even a church choir. I know that most of the churches that I know, a lot of the choirs will take the summer off. Maybe they've got some kind of special music in the summer. So the reason I lay that out for you is just to give you an idea of where I'm coming from with conceptualizing this episode. To keep a group of people locked in to a goal and locked into a process that is grueling, is sometimes hard for them to see the results of. It requires a master teacher. Some years I feel like I've got that. Like some years I feel like I'm mastering the room, in the sense that I can have them eating out of the palm of my hand all the way to May, right? And then some years you're feeling the need, and I've felt this too, feeling the need to just start over. Now, just to share what's going on right now for my school choir, I'm feeling like it's pretty good. Like it's a pretty good mid-year feeling, right? I've got some kids probably with some motivational problems. I've got some adults maybe with the, hey, what am I doing here in this choir? What is my place here? Kind of a thing. But for the most part, I feel like the choirs that I lead are progressing well. They're better than they were back in August, and they are having fun, and we're enjoying rehearsals, and we're making progress. And that's ultimately what I care about. That's how I evaluate myself as a teacher each year, is whether or not I can say that we're doing that, right? So that's kind of the background of this episode, and thinking back to the times in my teaching life and my conducting life where things have not gone well. And if things have gotten to this point of January where I'm feeling like, okay, can we just fast forward to next year and start over? That's like the worst feeling, right? Because then you see, then your year just drags on, right? It just keeps, it's like you're always looking for that finish line. And what I'm going to encourage us to do today is to think about ways that we can get past that feeling, so that we're not looking ahead to next year, that we're really living in the moment with each of our singers. That we're thinking about today and what we can do today and how we can be better tomorrow. And that concept, this ties in, we talked about this on episode 19 with Eric Barnum, the idea of growth mindset, antifragility, the idea that we're always going to be building towards something. And once the choir has that idea implanted into their brain, and I would argue that's your job, is to be the one who implants that mindset into them, then the ability for each day to be its own special thing really starts to blossom, because everybody starts looking at it as today is a journey on our way to this goal that's going to happen later, right? So here we go. Number one thing, and by the way, I put this on, this is going to be on the show notes as well. So if you're going back to look at this later because you want to implement some of these things, that's great. These are not ranked in like the order of importance. These are just ranked in the order that they came into my brain as I was typing. Okay, so the first one I'm going to talk about is keep sight reading. This is number one. Keep sight reading every single day as part of your warm-up if that's when you do it. But the main thing is that it's part of some kind of routine. You can go back to episode 18 to have me lay out how I do it. But it's the bottom line is it's part of a routine. Okay, now you might immediately be thinking, okay, so I thought he was going to talk about things to keep things fresh, right? Or ways to keep things fresh. And if you're talking about something being part of a routine, then maybe that's the opposite of fresh. But here's the thing. Your job in teaching their literacy skill through that sight reading exercise each day or lesson or whatever it is that you, however you think of it in your rehearsal, your job is to keep it fresh by keeping ahead of them, by keeping them guessing. My students wonder what I'm going to make them do next when it comes to that sight reading factory exercise that we do every day. So again, could be things like on one day I might pull up the exercise on a screen and just kind of be inspired based on what I see there. Ooh, this one would be a really fun one to do without solfege syllables. Just make them sing. It's maybe I noticed that it's more stepwise than a typical level 5 or 6 exercise might be. And so I'm going to challenge them and say, okay, guys, we're going to see if you can read this now just on a neutral syllable. Okay, so that would be a basic one. One thing I like to do, and you should try this, it's super fun. You've probably all done the exercise, the solfege exercise that is do, do, re, mi, re, do, and then all the way up and down the scale, right? Many people have done that. It's a great one for no other reason other than just getting the mechanics of the hand signs up and down to be in their kind of rote memory so that they're flying through exercises using their hands, and that's a really kinesthetic part is really important. That's a different episode though. So you get that, and then I might say things to them like, all right, so this time you're going to do it, but you're going to audiate only and not sing me and so. So then they might go do, do, re, do, re, do, re, fa, re, do, and they're leaving out, right? So they can do that during a warm-up, and you can have kids do that on the first day of school if you keep it simple enough. We're talking about, I don't care how old, 8-year-olds can do stuff. If the pattern is simple enough, they can do that right away. Okay, so then you take that, so I'll do that solfege exercise, and then the sight reading comes up on the screen. And I'll say something like, so do you remember how during our solfege warm-up we didn't sing me and so? Okay, so those are still off limits during the sight reading. You can't sing me or so. So then they're reading things on the screen that have and, but they have to see it coming, audiate it, and then sing the next pitch. Right, so I'm just listing, there's no way that I could even if I dedicated a whole podcast episode to just this, that I could explain all of the different ways you could tweak their sight reading to keep them guessing, to keep them having fun and laughing at themselves. Physical motions are another one. Sometimes we might do as part of that sight reading exercise, well, instead of me, you're gonna clap, right? So the me becomes a clap. Do, re, do, re, do, right? And then you can carry that right into the sight reading. So then they're clapping, like whenever they see a me, and then one voice part might be doing it at one time, distracts another group, and then they giggle, and there's all kinds of ways to engage their brain during that sight reading process so that it isn't, and this is where I would really be careful, is if your sight reading routine is truly a routine where it's literally the same activity every single day, short a new exercise, right? So, but every day you're singing a scale and you're singing the starting pitch, and then you're singing the exercise, move on. If you're not talking about concepts during that time, if you're not throwing in music theory, if you're not throwing in vocal development, during that time, then you are running the risk, I think, of falling into a sight reading rut at the beginning of rehearsal, where your warm-ups, your sight reading process, if they can predict before class starts exactly everything that's going to happen, you will lose them. You will lose them. So basically, if you feel like your kids are bored with the beginning of class routine that you've established for them, you are boring them. Don't let yourself be fooled in thinking that my kids are bored. This is something that is happening to me. No, your kids are bored. You are boring them. So change it up. And I gave you a couple examples, but again, I'd be happy to help you brainstorm, especially if you're on that Choralosophers group. We can go there and chat about more ideas of things that I have, because ultimately, I've been doing this long enough now that oftentimes I do just wing it. So I don't want you to think that I've got like this big long list of things. What I do though is I go into class for that sight reading portion every day thinking about, how am I going to trick them? How am I going to keep them guessing? How am I going to make them giggle? How am I going to make them feel like they're plugged in and like they're playing a video game? That's ultimately what I want sight reading to feel like for them at the beginning of class. Like, this is a game and I want to win. That's how my kids think about it, because I'm always throwing challenges. So I would encourage you to look at it that way and try that out. Inject some mystery into the sight reading process. Okay, number 2, raise the bar. I don't care where your bar is. Just raise it. Okay, I don't care if you're working with a professional choir, a top-level collegiate choir where the students have to come like knowing all their music. I don't care what it is. Raise the bar. Because once a choir of any level gets it into their DNA, to their brain, that they're good, like that they have achieved some level of amazingness, that your year's done. Like, it's over. They will become complacent. And it's our job as the director to stay out in front. This ties back to the concept of the sight reading that I just talked about. It's the same thing, and it could be in reference to your musicality, to your independence within each section of whether singers are being truly independent with their contribution in the choir. It could be responsibilities of section leaders. There has to be something that when you come back from a break, you could say, all right, so we achieved this last time. Now here's the next goal, right? So it's raising the bar. For me, in a high school setting, I'll lay it out from the way I think about it for high school kids, is that one of the things we get good at really fast, because of my focus on literacy in the classroom, is they get really good at reading the notes and rhythms the first time. After a while, when they're in their advanced levels, they can just sing it, which is great. But that runs the risk of them thinking that, oh, well, I could sing the notes right the first time, so am I done now? And it becomes my job to constantly remind them that there is something you could have sung more beautifully in that line. Yes, you sang the right notes and rhythms, but was it the right vowels? Was it even sung sensitively? Was it, were you making evidence that you were thinking about a phrase during that time? There's always something you can add on. And again, it goes back to that concept again of choir is like this is going to be dumb and reveal my nerdiness, but like a role-playing video game. Your character can always level up. You can always get experience points, and no matter how good you are and how many dragons you've killed, you can always level up your character and add new stuff. And that's what I love about choral music and rehearsing choral music. So that's the main aspect of number 2, is ultimately that you are a role-playing video game character creating some kind of new skill. And if they buy into that concept, then you won't ever run out of stuff to do. One of my biggest pet peeves is when a conductor gets in front of a group and lets them hear something along the lines of, hey, I don't know what else to say. You guys sound so great. Ugh, drives me crazy, because what that means is that conductor lacks the imagination to think of what's next. And I think it also sends the wrong message to kids. Could we complement a choir? Absolutely. Yes. If you rehearse a choir and you think they sound great, you can be very complimentary without letting them think that they are done. I think that's the biggest danger around this concept, is that once the choir thinks they're done, they've achieved the level, the highest. This is why a role-playing video game versus like Mario Brothers, right? Mario Brothers, you can beat the game. You can get to the end and be done. Okay? We want to play video games that are role-playing that never end, right? So this is your Elder Scrolls or your Dungeons and Dragons, which I've never played, by the way. But it's like that. Okay, so let's think about it that way. Okay, so number 3, group building is not just for the first day of school. And group building is not downtime. And group building is not an off day where you give the kids a break. It's important, so do it more. Now, of course, I don't know how much you do it, but I think just in general, one of the things that I notice is that there are a couple different attitudes with the concept of doing group building within a rehearsal. There are some types of choral settings, I understand, where that just wouldn't be natural. Kind of I guess you could say, a pro plug and play choir type of a scenario where you've got professional musicians showing up for a weekend to put together the music and then do a concert. I'm not talking about that, but pretty much any other scenario that I can imagine, whether it be church, school, or community, building community within the choir needs to be intentional or it just won't happen. So a couple ways to think about that. I've heard different ways people describe that as, my kids are just feeling really tired today, so I just let them rest. Or we just got done with a concert, so I let them just have a day off. So my take on that is I'm a very much of a no days off kind of choir teacher, but doesn't mean that every day has to be the same, right? So in theory, you could have no days off, but have a wide range of different types of productive activities that students and or your singers do that doesn't look like a traditional rehearsal. So there could be, to an outside observer, let's say if you're a school teacher and your administrator walks in to evaluate you on a particular day where that particular activity might not look like a choir rehearsal, and maybe they are confused or a little bit frustrated with you because you're not teaching that day, which that's happened to me on several occasions, by the way. But it's still productive time. And I've always made the argument to my administrator or co-teachers or whoever it is that that might think that that was a waste of time, that no, we're not wasting time when we sit down, because my kids don't sit, so they stand on risers the whole time. So if it's group building time, we'll sit them down, and there would be some type of engaging activity where they're all required to participate. It's either a philosophical discussion on the direction of the choir. It could be a storytelling time where we all get to know each other by sharing instances of things that fall into a certain category. Like I might say, let's tell stories about times we got injured, or let's tell stories about most embarrassing moments. What those types of things. It doesn't have to be anything special, but the point is that it is productive time. And my argument for that essentially is this. Yes, sitting them down for rehearsal and group building is an entire day lost in the sense of not learning notes and rhythms. But what I find that does, especially with young singers, but I believe this to be true in church and adults choir settings as well, but that group building time means that when it's time to work hard on a different day later, I know in my scenario, when we're getting into real serious rehearsal mode, I'm driving those kids really hard. I'm expecting a lot of them, and I'm expecting a lot of their 100% focus for 100% of the time of the rehearsal. And if you've watched my grading rubric episode or listened to that just go back a few episodes and check out how strict my grading policy is. I mean, I look at kids on a all the time, sometimes, most of the time or never rubric, where most of the time doing the correct things in rehearsal is a C. Okay, so that's strict, and I know that it's strict. And since I know that it's strict, My belief is that if they know that the people around them, including me as the director, are invested in them as people, they know who I am through my stories that I tell, that I know who they are through the stories that they tell, then I can call upon that goodwill. And I don't even call it goodwill, but I can call on uh, that knowledge that they have that I'm on their side when the rubber hits the road maybe 3 days later and we are really working hard, and I am demanding of them their best when maybe they don't want to be at their best because they came into my classroom with a problem from home or a problem with a boyfriend or a girlfriend or whatever might be going on in their life, where they weren't coming into the rehearsal with the mindset of being 100% focused. But because we spent that group building time earlier, I can see that they're not 100% at their best, and I can demand that they flip the switch to get ready for rehearsal and be there for the group, where I don't think I could successfully demand that of them. And I use the word demand not in any kind of negative connotation, but it's with the expectation or the understanding that when people come to a rehearsal in a choir that I'm leading, that I'm assuming because you walked in the room, you're wanting to be your best. And it's my job to try to pull that out of you. That's how I see one of the most important parts of my job is I'm there to motivate you. I'm there to motivate you to dig deeper into yourself than you thought you could go. And if we haven't established any kind of rapport as a group between conductor and student prior, then that same act of, again, you'll use the word demand, that same act of demand from me as the conductor could be looked at very differently. It could be looked at as, who is this guy and why is he telling me what to do? And instantly creating a negative environment. And I know that in years that I've done a good job of this, I see that to be true. And then I can also think of some years earlier in the episode, I talked about a really particularly rough year where I can think immediately to the lack of group building that we were doing early on in the year, and then throughout the year, almost to maintain that sense of morale. So I think that's a really important one. Don't just assume that first day of school get to know you games are all you need to do. Come back, hit it. I would say every couple weeks or so, some type of group building activity, sharing time, philosophical discussion, back and forth, Socratic seminar. Those are all different types of things that I do in class that are very, very important. Okay, I'm going to change gears just a second here and talk to you a little bit about some exciting things that are going on over at Patreon. On the Patreon page for this show, you can find that at patreon.com/choralosophy. The community over there is growing, becoming more and more engaged. And honestly, I couldn't have dreamt that in the first year of this show, we'd have 20 people over there who are of their own free will volunteering to support the financial side of this show. And it's really inexpensive for what you would pay at Starbucks to get a coffee once a month, as little as $3 a month. You can become a subscriber over there, and the benefits to you there are of kind of getting to be in the behind the scenes conversation of the show, a little bit more of a direct access to how the show is made. There are once a month a patron only episode over there that you get to see that no one else gets to see. There is also a pre-booking, so when I book a guest, I don't announce who's going to be on the show until the show is, of course, published. But over on Patreon, you get to find out who's coming on the show prior to who's coming on the show, so that if you have any questions for that person ahead of time, we're going to try to start that as a tradition on there where in future shows, hopefully in 2020, we're going to have enough questions built up from our Patreon where that guest gets to kind of answer some questions that aren't from me, but they're from you, from the community over there on Patreon. So that's another thing. And then finally, one of the other big benefits of being a patron on the Patreon page is that any extra documents and or resources that I've either created, which it takes me a lot of extra work beyond just making the show, I will publish them on there so that subscribers have access to that extra content. The best way that I could explain that to you, I'm not apologizing for asking you to help in that way for those extra resources, but here's how I would explain it. It takes a lot of my time and energy to create the show itself. Now, the show itself is free, right? But already it takes me quite a bit of time to create an episode. In fact, to create an episode like the one I'm doing right now, when it's just me, that actually is quite a bit labor intensive. Believe it or not, it's easier to do an episode where a guest comes on and I can just banter back and forth. It requires almost no prep. Whereas these kind of how-to episodes that you seem to like as an audience are the ones that take the most work. And so what I'm asking for you to do is, if you want that extra stuff, all of that extra stuff that you decide to vote with your money, $3 a month, it's relatively painless, and Patreon just pulls it from your PayPal or whatever once a month and you don't even notice it. I support other types of publications myself on Patreon, and I just get a notification once a month that they've pulled that $5 or $10 or whatever out of my account, and I barely even notice that it's gone, right? So, but at least it makes me feel good that some of the publications that I get a lot out of are getting my support. So I'm presenting that to you as an option, and if you don't want to take it, that's totally fine. Just be aware that that's why that's there, and if at any point you decide to jump on the Patreon to get that extra stuff, that extra benefit, feel free to do that. Again, there are $3 as low as $3 a month. You can jump into that community. So I encourage you to go check that out. Patreon.com/Chorealosophy. Okay, number 4, set goals. That sounds obvious. Why is he talking about that on a podcast? Set goals, I'm not quite done, and make them as public to your singers as you possibly can. Don't assume, and this is a mistake I see a lot, don't assume that because the goals and the classroom expectations, organizational goals in a community choir, church worship goals in a church choir at the beginning of a season were communicated, that the singers present will have those goals at the forefront of their mind from August all the way to May. In fact, you should assume they won't. That's hard for us sometimes to see as directors until we realize that it is our job to eat, sleep, and breathe the goals of the choir throughout the entire season. It's not the singer's job. It would be great if it was. Our jobs would be so much easier if it was their job to come into every rehearsal focused on a goal. And many of our best, of course, our best singers and our best team members do that. But that's not necessarily true of all of us. For most of our singers, singing in a choir is one of many things that they do, one of many things that's on their plate. I know at teaching the high school level, many of you know this is true. Our kids are pulled so thin. They're stretched so thin. They're taffy that you can see through, right? Because of how many people are pulling at them with different expectations. Now, it is reasonable to expect that when they are with us, they are focused. But that will require, I think, some goal setting that comes back throughout the year. And back when you come back after a break at the beginning of January, I believe that's the perfect time to reestablish with everybody, what is it that we are working towards? And the important part is, what are we working towards and why? Don't assume, again, that they remember or that that's on the forefront of their mind. It's okay to re-articulate. In fact, if I'm accused of erring on as it relates to communicating with choirs directly, I will err on the side of over-communicating why we're doing what we're doing and why it matters, who it matters to, what is it in it for you, what's in it for me, why are we here, what is the purpose of this ensemble, why are you in it, why am I leading it? All of those conversations have to be articulated. I'm not going to walk through all the SMART goal things, but many of you are familiar. It's an acronym, SMART goals. I'd check those out because they are a really good guideline for whether or not the goals you've made for yourself as the conductor, your ensemble, whether or not they are SMART, measurable, achievable, all the things that SMART stands for. So I would check that out as a system too, to build goals. But if you're winging it, in terms of what the long-term and short-term goals are for you and your choir, it will be very hard to communicate goals to the singers. If you're not communicating the goals, then they're not going to have any, because they'll start to develop their own. Actually, it would be a better way to say that. Everyone will have goals all the time. We are an incentive-based species. We will always have goals. What you want in a group activity is for everybody, while they're there, to at least be rowing in the same direction in the boat, right? Which makes our rehearsals more productive, long-term growth, all of the things that need to happen. So I would encourage you to get up on the podium in front of a class, in front of a church choir, your adult choir, and just outline for them again what those goals are. Okay, number 5. This one's a little tricky. You might have seen on the promo image for this episode that there are a couple things that I'm throwing at you as your responsibility. Number 5 is create engaging rehearsals. Again, seems obvious, and how would you do that? Well, in my opinion, it has to start and finish with you being an engaging person. In the same way that if they're bored sight reading, it's because you're boring. If they are not engaged in rehearsal, it's because you're not engaging them. That is something that is your responsibility. And here are some insights that I'd like to give you on being an engaging person. There are some of you out there, and I'm not trying to throw you under the bus, but maybe you're one of those kind of introverted personalities that it's very hard for you to be exciting, right? To get up in front of a group of people and just pour out energy. That is easier for some people than others. It's a talent. It's one of the things that makes a great conductor, is whether or not a person in the choir stares at that person and just can't look away, right? That is an important part of it. And I don't know that I can teach that to you, with the exception of this one thing: learn to be yourself. A person, no matter how their personality might present to the world, is more interesting to other people, is more engaging to other people when it seems authentic. Okay? So I'm going to illustrate this with a story. When I was a practicum student, so a young undergraduate, we all did it, where we had to go out into classrooms, and it was pre-student teaching even. So I think I was probably 3rd or 4th year undergrad. I did 5 years for undergrad, so 3rd or 4th year, somewhere in there. And this was going to be my first time in front of a high school choir, where I was in charge of leading the rehearsal. Okay, so I'd interacted with kids up to this point, but I had never been the one who's in charge of the rehearsal. This was going to be my first time. And one of the assignments that we were given for that project was that we were supposed to bring, and I'm going to date myself here, a VHS camera and record that rehearsal. So I did. I think it was some madrigals. I was rehearsing some madrigals, and they were in Italian, if I remember correctly. And the assignment for that videotape was to take it to a trusted advisor / mentor / more experienced teacher to watch the video with them and get feedback. Somebody who we believed would give us honest feedback. So I chose to take it to my high school choir teacher, to Steve Perry. Some of you might know him. And Steve, this is the second time I've told a story about you on this podcast. I apologize, but you kind of are responsible for creating this monster, so you might have to deal with it. So I take the video to Steve, and of course the fantasy in my mind at the time was that Steve would watch this video and he would just be so overwhelmed with pride for the progress and the growth that I had achieved in my young life since I left high school and had gone to college, and look at all the fancy words he's learned, and look at all the historical knowledge that he's learned, and look at how much of his conducting gesture is blossoming, right? So in my head, all these things, this is surely going to be how he responds. He's just going to gush with pride from watching this video. And he didn't. He watched the video, and his first response was, "Chris, I was so bored watching that. I wanted to tear out my eyebrows." And I was crushed, right? I was none of the things that I was hoping he would say. He said it was his first and biggest reaction was how bored he was watching that rehearsal. And it was a kick in the pants, but I needed to hear it. And I went back and watched the video again with his feedback in my head, and I went, "Oh my goodness, he's right. That's a horrible rehearsal. If I was a teenager in that rehearsal, I don't care about learning the word hemiola and what it means. Like, I want to have fun, and I want to be engaged. I want to be not preached at, but I want to be interacted with." And I was doing none of that. I was hiding behind my music stand and lecturing in between attempts at rehearsal. And it just wasn't interesting. And the other bit of feedback that Steve gave me in that project was that it was to turn it around on me and say, "Chris, in your normal life, you are funny and you make dumb jokes and you're goofy and you're smart, but you say things in a way that's unique to you. And I didn't see any of that in this rehearsal. So I was looking for the real you, and I didn't see any of that. And that was extremely a formative experience for me. I think back to it all the time when I'm seeing young teachers kind of stumble up on the podium, is I'm waiting for them to figure out who they are and how to be that person on the podium the same as when they're off the podium. Now here's why that's so important. So for a rehearsal to be engaging, in a lot of ways it has to do with pacing. It has to do with the time spent singing, getting feedback that is helpful and that is constructive, and minimizing the amount of time that takes so that the next bit of rehearsal can start, so that they're like thinking about that video game again. They're always thinking about the next thing to do. So the problem is, if the music happens and you as the conductor are not able to be yourself, then you're going to hear the music. You're going to have to filter what you say through the character of someone else that you are playing, rather than responding as you. Okay? Now, that's just going to slow you down. And a slowed response time between singing and instruction / getting back into the singing is the surest fire way I've ever seen of killing a rehearsal, killing the vibe in a rehearsal, killing the pacing of a rehearsal. And so here's a quick tip, especially for you young directors. In your head, every single time that you are singing, this is slightly a tangent, but every single time you hear the choir singing, there are 3 things at minimum, especially when you're starting out, that should be spinning in your head, ready to come out as soon as they're done singing. What do I say if it exceeded my expectations? It was just amazing. And their attempt was way beyond what I thought it was going to be. How am I going to respond? And how am I going to respond immediately when they're done, so that they feel the joy that I feel, like in that moment? That's one possibility. Door number 2 is they're about at where I expected them to be, meaning I had an idea of notes and rhythms they might miss. They missed them. I had an idea of vocal technical things that they might have had problems with. They had the problems, but for the most part, it was a good attempt, right? And that elicits a different response, and it again has to be ready as soon as they're done singing. And so they get that next thing to do, because even though it was what you expected and you're proud of that attempt, you get that positive feedback, they're ready to go on. And then there's the third response, which is that it did not go well. And they need to have some kind of an immediate feedback of not being punished, but immediately what about that attempt was not successful, and what little small piece of that attempt can we go back and try again and try to scaffold it and build it to be a more successful passage of music, or whatever it is that we're trying to attempt. And so I throw that tangent in there as advice I give to student teachers and to young teachers all the time, and through the lens of being yourself. Because if you have, that's a lot to think about, right? For a young director too, especially where you're reading the music during that attempt and you're trying to figure out all the stuff that's going on, and to still have all of those ready plug and play responses ready every time they sing something, that's hard. And if you're playing a character that you think you should be in front of them rather than your authentic self, it's going to be really, really hard to do that. So that's a long one. And that's a lot to digest, so feel free to reach out with questions on that one. But I think that's probably the most important aspect, is the number 5. Like I said at the beginning, I have not ranked these in any kind of way, but that might be the most important one, is creating engaging rehearsals by being engaging. That ultimately means being yourself. Okay, number 6, interpret the text. And again, sounds obvious. Why is this on the podcast? But I think this is done in a lot of rehearsals, in a lot of classrooms that I've observed. It's not done enough. In some ways, it's another opportunity for group building, which goes back to an earlier point. If you are sitting the choir down to interpret the text, you are creating an opportunity for them to express what the music means to them and what the text means to them. It's also a good opportunity to point out that a lot of the music we sing in the choral world is great poetry. We are accessing great poetry. And the way I define that to students is poetry that is great if it has layers. If you could read it once and interpret it at the beginning of the rehearsal process. And then we add the talent of these composers that are setting this great poetry, and they add this soundscape to that poetry. And then we've rehearsed it, we've learned it, and then maybe 2 weeks later, we sit down again and interpret that text. What they will discover is with the text and the music together, there are new interpretations popping out of things that this poetry could mean, right? And then you get to point out the really important poetic concepts, like the intent of the writer of the poetry. Maybe it was a poet in 1882, right, who never knew this piece was going to be a choir song. What is the intent of the artist who wrote that poetry? And how is it that your reaction could be different than the intent of the poet? And is that right? Is that wrong? And most poetic analysis would suggest that that's actually a feature of poetry. That's not a bug in poetry, that of all art really, that the creator of the art could have an intent that does not match the response of that audience or of a performer later or whatever. And it's okay to talk about that because all of those things add to the onion. They are layers of the onion. So an example of something that is not great poetry, I'm gonna die on this hill. Not great poetry. Who let the dogs out? Who? There are no layers there. That is not going to go down in history as one of the greater poetic contributions to music, because it's got no layers. Okay, it's just what it is. It doesn't have. You're not going to come back to it 20 years from now and get new meaning out of that text, which is not true of a lot of the music that we sing in choir. So it's important to stop the rehearsal, group build by interpreting the text, and that could mean that you're going to have to do some research if you're not skilled in the area of poetic analysis. That's something that I love to study, and so that is a strength that I like to bring into the rehearsal. If that's not your natural bent, then I would encourage you to do the work with the particular poet or poem that you're working on, so that you're prepared to go into rehearsal and give the kids that type of experience, that literary experience that they really deserve in a choir class. Okay, last, but since these aren't ranked in an order of importance, literally not least, number 7, rehearsal morale, rehearsal etiquette, behavior, whatever you'd like to call it. If the morale or rehearsal etiquette is not what you think it should be mid-year, then you're going to have to shock the system. You're going to have to do something that puts them so far outside of their comfort zone that it becomes like the first few days of school for them, because this is so new. Who is this guy teaching us? Or, whatever it is that you have to do to change their perception of the rehearsal. In fact, I mentioned this early in the episode, the very beginning, Harry Wong's First Days of School. Wong, that we were all required to read, and as part of our first education methods classes. Not sure if it's still out there. Maybe it is. Maybe people are still given that. But one of the things we learned in that book was how difficult, and I've seen this to be true, by the way. Of course, I read it as an undergrad with no teaching experience and thinking, yeah, sure, whatever. But 15, 16 years into it later, I've determined this is true, that if certain expectations don't get established in the very beginning of a school year, it's very, very hard to get them going again. Okay, so that's one of the things that he talks about heavily in that book, is how important the first few days of school are. But let's say on the list of 7 things we've talked about in this episode, if you weren't establishing those as your routines early in the school year, and it's leading to some morale problems, it's leading to some lack of engagement in rehearsal, it's leading to some, usually what comes next from after those 2 problems is behavior problems. And when I was preparing for this episode, I was originally thinking of this one as more of a school context, but it's not. This is very much something that adults do too. I was getting ready to say that it was more for a classroom setting, but then I thought back to all my years in church choir and how many times I had to say things like children to a choir full of 80-year-olds. They will, if they're bored, will start having conversations and getting off task and distracting each other and maybe fighting and bickering and all kinds of things that we don't want to have in our choir rehearsal. So what do I mean by shocking the system? Let's say they've gotten into some bad habits, and it's January, you're coming back to the school year. Well, there's a list of things that I've done in the past when I've been guilty of letting things slide in the rehearsal, and I feel the need to shock the system. And in fact, the list of 7 things we've talked about in this episode so far are all on the table in terms of ways to reboot a rehearsal process or reboot the attitude of a choir. Sometimes it could mean group building. Sometimes it could just be a break in the routine and doing some text interpretation. Something that where they come into the rehearsal that day and things are not going well, so they expect another day of it not going well, and instead you throw them a curveball and do something that day that they're not expecting. Okay, another one I'll do occasionally, I call them LAD activities. LAD stands for listen, analyze, and describe, where that again could sound like a day off, but it's not a day off. If you're intentionally choosing listening examples or YouTube videos or whatever it is that you want them to learn something from that leads to an engaging rehearsal next time, and or at the very least, an engaging conversation about some type of choral topic that you think is important. I'll throw a lot of tone production, vocal examples at them, a lot of Voces 8 type rehearsal recordings or performance recordings, because they do such a great job in those videos of letting the singers, the young or old singers, see the articulator motion. And if on the YouTube channel, you just saw me make 2 dumb faces. Okay, on the podcast, you didn't get to see that. Yeah, that's probably good for you. But in those Voces 8 videos, they show up close what good singing looks like. And it's important because it's so easy to just listen to a video of a group like that and revel in the sound because it's such a great sound. But I like to point out, have kids reflect on what does that look like? What do they look like when they're singing? Do you see the almost complete lack of tension in the body? Do you see the active articulators that are creating all those vowel colors and shapes? So there are ways to shock the system by just changing the routine. But if you don't feel like that's enough, there are some more shocking things that you can do. So one of the things that I like to do when things need to be shaken up, one of the first things I'll do, this is usually a first attempt, is a new standing or seating arrangement. Just make them not be by who they were yesterday that was causing all the bickering. Just break up the whole thing. Resit, restand, maybe completely change what sections are by who. I do a lot of mixed standing formations, so you've got your soprano and an alto, a tenor, and a bass, and then a soprano, alto, tenor, bass. Or sometimes I actually prefer STAB, just so that it's you're interspersing the tenors and the basses with the sopranos and altos. You have guy, girl, basically, to go back to our elementary school terminology. But you have ways to take their perspective about the rehearsal and completely change it. And that's, I'm fortunate in my classroom, I have space to do that. So another thing that I would do if the standing chart isn't enough is I might take them off of the risers completely. We've done things where I call it choir in a blender. In fact, I might even find the video, I don't remember if I put it on YouTube, of my high school chamber choir demonstrating what choir in a blender looks like. And where essentially the gist of it, if I can't find the video for the show notes, the gist of it is that each choir member picks their own path through the room. They're supposed to walk on the beat of the song, and their job is to try to explore the entire room during the course of the song. So they're not allowed to just walk in a circle over and over and over. They've got to go this way and this way and this way. And the reason it's called choir in a blender, this is how I explain it. I might have made this up. I feel like I did because I had to come up with this whole explanation of choir in a blender, because if you look inside of a blender and you follow one single strawberry, the metaphor is to the singer, but one single strawberry in the smoothie in the blender, it doesn't just go in a circle around the jar. You might think it does, but it doesn't. It goes around a circle until it bumps into a banana, and then it goes a different direction. Okay, so if choir in a blender means that each strawberry is going to try to explore, when they hit an obstacle, they're going to go a different direction. And the purpose of that, literally, is what we're talking about here in number 7. It's a shock to the system to hear the song in a different way not only from day to day, but from moment to moment within the song. And it's really, really valuable. And kids think it's fun too. It's harder to get a church choir to do it. I have done it though before. It's harder because the mobility is not as good in a church choir. But to just have them shifting and moving and trying to hear how their part fits in, depending on who they're around. Okay, and so it's interesting, it's fun, it's a way to, it keeps them too busy to really have behavior problems. But ultimately, the morale problems are where, that's when you know things are really bad, right? It's when you feel very strongly a vibe in the room that people do not want to be there, right? And that there is some kind of obligation, they're there to get their grade, but beyond that, there is not much willingness from the choir to go that extra mile. So I'll end today with really what I see as the only way to approach that, and that is to lay all your cards personally on the table. I've been known sometimes to cry in front of choirs where I feel the morale is not where it's supposed to be. And I don't do it on purpose, but sometimes I will tell a story or implore them so personally that my emotional side just pours out, because I feel like I need to allow my vulnerability to show if I have any hope of their vulnerability showing. So there are stories that I might tell that really reveal the why of why I'm a director and why I want them to be there with me on that journey. And that could bring out a lot of vulnerability, and maybe it could appear to, if an administrator walked into the room while I was giving one of those speeches, maybe like, this is TMI. Why is he sharing all this information with them? That's not very professional, right? But ultimately, if they're not going on the journey with us, they might have to have their system shocked by them seeing even deeper of a level of your onion, which not everyone's comfortable with, but I have found that is, when things get really bad, it's my only tool left in the toolbox. So I encourage you to think about what is the why that maybe your kids don't know yet, maybe your singers don't know yet, and again, you save that for that very last ditch effort when things are not going the way you want them into the rehearsal. All right, thanks a lot for sticking around to this episode. I think there are tons of things I touched on in this episode that could become their own full episode. In fact, I wouldn't mind doing an episode on those deeper and darker whys that I have as a director. Just give you an example. I don't have time to go into them on this episode, but I think the point is not that I would need to provide that information for you, because you all have those for yourself. But it might just be interesting for some people to know, as the host of the show, as some of the things that motivate me that maybe you wouldn't know about, whereas some of my singers do know about them if I've ever had to have those conversations. So that's an option. So thanks again for sticking around to the end. Hopefully you got something out of these. Like I said at the beginning, even if you found only one or two of them interesting, I feel like I did my job here by giving you some tools in your toolbox to keep the year fresh and to keep the rehearsal process fresh. I also would suggest and encourage you on the way out to reach out to Graphite Publishing, ryanmain.com, for your sheet music needs, and use that promo code Choralosophy at checkout. It helps them know that you're listening, and it also helps me on the other side very much in paying the bills of this show when you choose to get some sheet music occasionally from one of those folks, since we got to get it anyway, right? And you can also head over to vocevista.com and sightreadingfactory.com, and those are more of your in-class tools for music literacy, and now with Voce Vista, the literacy of understanding resonance, overtones, giving students and singers a picture of their own voice so that they can start to visualize what it is that they're doing right, what they're doing wrong. All of those things are tools that, as listeners to the show, you can use that Choralosophy checkout code and get 10% off. It helps us, helps you. It's awesome. And finally, if you liked the episode, like, subscribe, share. Really, really helpful when you guys share the episodes. It drives traffic. Also, leaving a rating or a review on the podcast app that you use is very helpful. And of course, like I mentioned earlier, head over to patreon.com/Choralosophy and join that community for as little as $3 a month. Happy New Year, and we'll see you soon. coming up in a couple weeks, within the next week or so, episode 28. And if you want to find out who that guest is, jump on over to the Patreon, and you'll be able to find out who that guest is coming up really soon and be able to supply some questions. So see you then.